Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you're all well, insha'Allah ta'ala. Today I will go through a few important rulings related to the recitation after Surah Fatiha in the prayer, in the third rakat and in the fourth rakat of a fard prayer. To recite after Surah Fatiha is disliked. One will avoid reciting after Surah Fatiha in the third and fourth rakat of a fard prayer. Other than these two units, i.e. the third and fourth unit of a fard namaz, fard prayer, after Surah Fatiha, one must reciting one long verse of Al-Quranul Kareem is wajib, or reciting three small verses. Three small verses that are equal to one long verse of Al-Quranul Kareem. Three small verses like the three small verses of Surah Al-Muddathir, Thumma Nadhar, Thumma Abasa wa Basar, Thumma Adbara wa Stakbar. The surah one recites in the second rakat after Surah Fatiha must be a surah that comes after the surah he had recited in the first rakat after Surah Fatiha, i.e. one must make sure that the sequence of the surahs are in the correct order. He can't recite a surah in the second rakat after Surah Fatiha that comes before the surah he had recited in the first rakat after Surah Fatiha. For example, if he recites Surah Nas in the first rakat after Surah Fatiha and Surah Falaq in the second rakat, this will be wrong, incorrect, because Surah Falaq comes first. That will be recited in the first rakat, and Surah Nas comes after Surah Falaq, so that will be recited in the second rakat. So if one does not take care of the sequence, he recites the Quran in the reverse order, he will be sinful if he does this intentionally, but his salah will not become invalid, neither will sajda sahab become necessary upon him, neither will it be necessary upon him to repeat the namaz. So if he does this unintentionally, we won't say sajda sahab will become necessary upon him. His salah will still be valid. If he does this intentionally, his salah won't become invalid, but yes, due to reciting the Quran in the reverse order, he will be sinful. He will be sinful, hence after he completes his namaz, he must do tawbah, he must repent in the court of Allah Ta'ala, and he must seek the forgiveness of Allah Ta'ala. And remember, in the four rakat prayers, the four sunnah prayers, or for nafil prayer, to maintain the order in the first two units and in the final two units is also necessary. Okay? So the first two units are separate, and the final two units, the third rakat and fourth rakat, they are separate. So the surah one recites after Surah Fatiha in the third rakat. If it comes before the surah he had recited after Surah Fatiha in the second rakat, no problem, this is allowed. Yes, but he must maintain the order in the first two rakats and in the final two. So the first two are separate and the final two are separate. So the surah he recites after Surah Fatiha in the second rakat, like I mentioned before, must come after the surah he had recited after Surah Fatiha in the first rakat. Likewise, the surah he recites after Surah Fatiha in the fourth rakat must come after the surah he had recited after Surah Fatiha in the third rakat. And the surah he recites in the second rakat must be shorter than the surah he had recited in the first rakat. So if he recites Surah Feel in the first rakat and Surah Ma'un in the second rakat, this is not correct. This is makruh, disliked. Surah Feel is shorter than Surah Ma'un. If both the surahs are equal, they ayat, their verses are the same. They have the same number of verses. For example, Surah Inshirah, Alam Nashrah, this surah, and Surah Bayyina. These two surahs have 8 verses. Surah Inshirah and Surah Bayyina. These two surahs have 8 verses, but Surah Bayyina has more huruf, more letters. In this case, one cannot recite Surah Bayyina in the second rakat after Fatiha and Surah Inshirah after Fatiha in the first rakat, even though the surah have the same number of verses, but because Surah Bayyina has more huruf, more words, this is why it is makruh to recite Surah Bayyina in the second rakat, even though Surah Bayyina comes after Surah Inshirah. And if the surah recited in the second rakat is longer by 2 verses or 1 verse compared to the surah that was recited in the first rakat, this is allowed. Yes, if it is longer by 3 verses or more, then it is disliked. So if one recites Surah Kawthar in the first rakat after Fatiha and he recites Surah Ikhlas in the second rakat after Surah Fatiha, this is allowed because Surah Kawthar has 3 verses and Surah Ikhlas has 5 verses. So Surah Ikhlas has 2 more verses more than Surah Kawthar, hence this is allowed. Yes, if the surah recited in the second rakat has 3 verses or more, then it will be makruh to recite that surah in the second rakat. Yeah, and the surah, if it has more words, both the ayat, the numbers of the ayat are the same of both surahs, and the surah recited in the second rakat has more words. In this case, like I mentioned, this is also makruh, disliked, and there shouldn't be a gap of 1 surah between 2 surahs. The surah recited in the first rakat, he recites it and then he misses the surah in between and he recites the next surah in the second rakat. This is also disliked if the surah in between is small. For example, he recites Surah Nasr in the first rakat and in the second rakat he recites Surah Ikhlas. In between is Surah Lahab. Surah Lahab is a small surah, so hence he mustn't do this. This is makruh if he leaves a gap of 1 small surah in between. Yes, if the surah is long, it's tawil, then there's no problem. For example, he recites Surah Teen in the first rakat and he recites Surah Qadr in the second rakat. In between is Surah Alaq, it is a long surah. In this case, there's no karaha, no problem. His salah will be valid. And in all of the cases I mentioned, the salah will be valid, sajda-i-sahab will not become necessary. And if one recites the same surah in every rakat, Surah Ikhlas after Fatiha, his salah will still be valid. If he does this in the fard prayers, he knows more than 1 surah but he chooses to recite the same surah, for example Surah Ikhlas in every rakat, this action is makruh tanzihi, disliked, but he won't be sinful and his salah will still be valid. But if he does this in the nafil prayers, there's no karaha, it is not disliked, this is allowed. But if he hasn't made the effort to memorize the final surahs of the 30th juz of Al-Quran Al-Kareem, I request him to make an effort to memorize at least the final 10 surahs of Al-Quran Al-Kareem. So in the prayer, you can recite different surahs and attain the love of the